So we can talk about relationships between variables and how they affect one another. And so this is sometimes referred to as feedback in terms of a cycle. But let's just look at relationships between variables initially. So we can talk about when we talk about one variable increasing, an increase in one causing an increase in another variable, that would be an example of a positive relationship. So we have positive relationship. So this is where we have an increase in one variable causes an increase in another variable. A good example of this might be an increase in the amount of light causes an increase in the productivity of the plants. So there's a positive relationship between the amount of light and the growth of the plants. We can also talk about negative relationships. So this is where you have an increase in one variable causes a decrease in another. So for example, we could talk about maybe there's a point where if you have excessively high temperatures, then you might, for example, have decreased plant growth in some instances. So that would be an example of a negative relationship, or increased temperatures. For example, maybe if you go up above a certain temperature, the plants just aren't able to grow anymore. Okay, so we can look at this in a social system, like in humans. So in this particular example, the population is one variable. So that's my population size. That's not something that I change. And so generally we call that the independent variable. This is something that we can change, and this is the amount of land that we convert to agriculture. So you see here that there is a positive relationship, and it is the same slope, so it's linear. And so for every 500 people, there's 400 more hectares. That's the scientific term for acre, but it's a little bit different. But that is a measurement of an area of land. So here we can see that this is a positive relationship. Now, when we look at the amount of forested area for human population, we can see that as we increase the human population, the amount of forested land decreases, and it's not linear. So here it's decreasing faster than up here. This has a greater slope in this line than this one. And so we can make some predictions, right? We could say, well, is this probably just going to maybe keep going? Or is there a point where we're not going to lose any more land? But we can use these relationships to make predictions, because it seems that these relationships are not random. Okay. So then we can put these into a system chart where we can see how all the variables influence one another. So this is what is referred to as a feedback loop. Now, sometimes a change will increase, one increase in one variable will increase the other, and that is called positive feedback. So for example, as we increase human population, we increase agricultural land, that's positive feedback. And then we increase our food supply, so that's positive feedback. Now you can see here that there's probably going to be a point where we run out of land, and then we crash the population, right? So positive feedbacks tend to not create stability in a system. When we look at this one, there is positive and negative. So it's kind of interesting. Wood supply increases when we increase rainfall. So that's a positive. But as we increase the human population, this decreases the amount of forested land. So you can see that that is a negative relationship. So these two are positive. This one actually would also be positive. This is a negative relationship. Now we can talk about feedback loops in terms of homeostasis. So let's look at an example that is important today when we're looking at CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So let's look at the negative feedback mechanism, which is actually good. It's actually not bad. It's negative feedback mechanisms in our body, for example, help to maintain homeostasis. So we can see that we could have an increase in CO2, okay? So in the atmosphere. As we increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, this causes an increase in CO2 taken up by plants in the rainforest. So we see that, oh, this is going to cause the plants to grow quicker because they have more CO2, right? So it's actually a mechanism that actually then decreases CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is a decrease in CO2 in the atmosphere. So sometimes this is referred to, this would be like the stimulus to the response, which then decreases the stimulus. So what is this? Is this negative or positive? This feedback is actually negative. So this is a negative feedback mechanism. And this might be one way that our planet would help to maintain homeostasis in terms of temperature, in terms of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is a good thing, even though it's called a negative feedback. It's a good thing because it helps to stabilize the system. So let's look at an example of positive feedback. So let's go to positive. So this is another example that's kind of well known, where we have an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Since it is a greenhouse gas, is going to increase temperatures. This increase in temperature is going to increase the thawing of the permafrost. So this increases permafrost thawing. This thawing of the permafrost could then therefore increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide is released. So now we have a positive feedback. So CO2 is actually one of the things that, one of the gases that's released in the permafrost, but also we could talk about methane. So let's look at an increase in methane. So this is methane. This is a gas, right? That is also a really potent greenhouse gas. Permafrost thawing could also increase the methane. So methane is being released into the atmosphere, and this is going to increase the greenhouse gases. So this is actually an example of a positive feedback mechanism. So this is a positive feedback. Is it good? No. It is going to cause ever more greenhouse gases until there's a point where we've put all the CO2 we can in the atmosphere, right? But this is going to dramatically change the stability of the ecosystems. So we can see that positive and negative feedback mechanisms are super important in determining whether or not a system can maintain its homeostasis, its stability, or whether it's going to reach a tipping point and it's going to dramatically change, maybe to an entirely new set point. So then whether or not the animals and plants can survive that new set point will be something that we can try to determine.